Hello, everybody, and welcome. Dr. Jamie here, Dr. Fit and Fabulous, and I have an amazing guest with us today who is the new author of this book that I just got called Immunity Fix. I have Dr. James Dinicolantonio. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with me here this morning. But the reason that I love this guy right here is that he talks about the evidence. He's a super smart, brilliant person who spent years researching nutrition, and I first got introduced to him when I found one of his first books called The Salt Fix, which everybody knows I'm a huge fan of more salt in our life. So he is well-respected, internationally known scientist and an expert on health and nutrition. He's got a fantastic Instagram and social media account you should go follow. But he's contributed extensively to health policy and medical literature. And I think in 2020, that is super important with what's going on with COVID-19. He is the author of not only Immunity Fix and Salt Fix, but he also has co-authored and authored more than 250 medical publications and sits on the editorial and advisory board of a few of those journals too. So Dr. Dinicolantonio, I'm gonna let you take the stage and tell us about Immunity Fix. How did this come to fruition? And what is so important about this book and why the world needs it right now?
Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that, Jamie. I think the reason why I wanted to write the book is obviously what's going on in the world. But then when I started doing research that our own metabolic health determines like our own immune health, and that you can simply fix your metabolic health within just a few weeks of going on like a good whole food nutritious diet. I think that is something that we've kind of missed in the media, and we've kind of not focused on, in regards to just social distancing or masking has been the focus.
Yeah, I think there's been a clear message that if you're old and if you're metabolically unhealthy, you are at risk of COVID-19. And the scary part as a practitioner is, to the average person sitting on their couch, they're probably not thinking, oh my gosh, that's me. Like, I'm the at-risk person, right? They feel like this immortality, they're in their 30s, but 88% of America has abnormal metabolic markers. And we know that from a great study a couple of years ago, that 88% of America cannot say that they're in optimal metabolic health. But talk about a little bit about kind of this pandemic that we're living in. We've had other pandemics before, but this one clearly probably a little bit of politics at play with it being an election year. But how does what we're experiencing with SARS-CoV-2 compare to what we experienced with, for instance, like the Spanish flu, which would have been considered one of the worst pandemics, of time?
So that's a good question. So the Spanish flu was caused by bird flu. H5N1 was, it took them a long time to figure out actually what caused it. I don't think they actually figured it out until I want to say like 20 years ago. They actually had to dig up the remains of people who were dead and test it. And that didn't happen for, I don't think, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. And there's been sort of some re-emergence of these bird flus in Hong Kong, because you have millions of birds that are sort of, in close quarters, and it's been jumping to humans on and off for the past several decades. And H5N1, at least the current strains that have been sort of kind of waxing and waning in Hong Kong, has a case fatality rate of about 60%. And when they've gone into those cities to see if that's an inflated number, they've gone and tried to look at and test people who are relatives of the people who have had this, to see, okay, maybe actually a lot of people have had it, and really the case fatality rate is actually really high. And when they actually go in and they've done numerous studies, they don't find that their relatives have it. And so they really believe that bird flu is potentially 50 to 60% fatal. Whereas the bird flu in 1918 had a case fatality rate of about 2 to 3%. And we're kind of seeing a similar case fatality rate right now with the current coronavirus. However, the actual fatality rate is likely to be dramatically underestimated for the 1918 bird flu. It was probably more like 10%, because at least 50 million people died, and they're thinking it could be upwards of 100 million. We just don't have good numbers because it was back over 100 years ago.
Right, right. So, my question as a practitioner is, of course, like, we got to get through these big waves, but like, where do we go from here? And I think a lot of the conversation is around whether it's herd immunity or whether it's vaccines, but we know traditionally that for coronaviruses in particular, that vaccination has never really worked. And I think I have a lot of skepticism as a practitioner to hear people get on TV and say, the vaccine is coming, the vaccine is coming. I think that's a very
Right.
false sense of security. Do you agree on that?
Yeah. So if you look at like, influenza vaccine, for example, oops, looks like our internet just cut out for a second. If you look at like the flu vaccine, it's typically only about 40% effective. Can you still hear me, Jamie?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay. So essentially, when it comes to RNA viruses, they mutate very frequently. So the vaccine, number one, will never be probably 100% effective. And number two, you're always going to probably have to get a new one every year because it changes every season, essentially. And so typical flu vaccines have quote unquote been about 40% effective. Now, we don't necessarily know what that means. Does that mean it actually reduces hospitalizations from the flu and deaths from the flu? We don't really know. Do you elicit like a response after you get the vaccine? Does that actually mean you're protected? So I don't think we have a good measurement on what actual efficacy even means with these vaccines. And the safety too, I think we need a lot more data as well.
Yeah, so certainly we're going to take a risk if one comes out, right? We don't have long-term data, long-term efficacy like you're pointing out. Do you need a booster? How often do you need a booster? But I think the other thing that gives a false sense of security is that when we look at how vaccines actually work, on a population level, the people that they are designed to protect that are at most at risk for something like COVID-19 are people who are older and people who are obese or metabolically unhealthy. But you actually need a good immune system for vaccines to work. And these are the people that have bad immune systems. So it's like what they were created for is not the people, right? They're basically given to create instantaneous herd immunity, essentially.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think the main point is that we're already seeing new strains with this current coronavirus. That's totally different. And it seems to be more transmittable already. And so what strain is the vaccine even going to be matched against? And so whether or not, we could debate all day whether or not vaccines work or don't, but you can always improve your own health. And that's really the key message that like most people should know.
Yeah, and that's what I love is essentially the key message of Immunity Fix. So, and I'm not even all the way through it, but I think some of the most important chapters are actually towards the end of the book. So my followers know that I talk about kind of the 5 things that you like control the controllables. So let's kind of go through those because that's what I think is so important for people to hear. So the first one is nutrition. So can you talk a little bit about how nutrition and nutrients in the diet either help or hurt our immunity?
So essentially 60% of Americans, their diet is made up of basically refined carbohydrates, sugar, and seed oils. And obviously we never used to have that just 100 years ago. So evolutionarily, we're completely mismatched in regards to like what we're consuming now versus what we consumed even a couple hundred years ago. And essentially, when you consume a diet high in refined carbohydrates and sugar, that leads to high insulin levels. And now all of a sudden, you start losing minerals out in the urine. And when you're insulin resistant, you can't even utilize your nutrients because many nutrients like magnesium and potassium, they actually need good insulin signaling to get into the cell to even work. And so since 80% of the US adults have insulin resistance, that's a huge problem for our immune system to function because they need those nutrients to work.
Yeah. So as somebody who used to be a former pre-diabetic, since being more low carb, getting insulin sensitivity in check, I literally am not even sure I've been sick. Maybe once. I can definitely count it on one hand. So I've experienced that. But one thing we're seeing as COVID has come is like just take more vitamins and minerals, like just take these supplements, take more vitamin D, take zinc. Can you talk a little bit about what do nutraceuticals and things like that? Is it like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole? Are they helpful? What should people know about that?
So if you are deficient or severely deficient, to give you an example, you only have to treat 4 people with vitamin D to prevent 1 upper respiratory tract infection if they have vitamin D deficiency. And so I think nutraceuticals are extremely powerful if you're actually deficient. Whereas if you're eating a good diet and you have optimal nutrient intake, whether supplementation is going to really be a magic bullet or not is probably less likely.
And they can be harmful. So more isn't necessarily better when it comes to nutrients and nutraceuticals. Some of these things are stored in the body, but there's evidence too that they can be harmful. So I always like to think of almost everything as a U-shaped curve, that you don't want to be down here, but you don't want to be up here, and you have to find the middle ground. But certainly diet is number one for nutrition and for nutrient status, but our food is clearly not as nutrient dense as it used to be, and some people have difficulty sourcing food with lots of nutrients. And of course, the foods that most people eat are cheap and fortified and full, like you said, of flours and sugars and vegetable oils and things like that. Okay, so all the rage in 2020, intermittent fasting. Can you talk about how that affects our immune system, or why that might be a good tool for people as we move forward out of COVID?
So Walter Longo published several studies in mice showing that if you put them if you take away their calories, you can sort of reset their immune system after about 3 days. And essentially it's something like how autophagy works is basically when you are no longer ingesting calories, you're not growing, you're actually thinking about like repair, and your autophagosomes will start sort of self-consuming proteins and cellular membranes that they don't need. And you sort of start repairing damaged proteins, and that includes the immune system as well. And so there's evidence to suggest that if someone does like a 2 to 3 day fast, maybe every 2 to 3 months, you may sort of reset your immune system. But you don't want to fast when you're acutely sick. So it's just like everything, like the dose makes the poison, and you like just got to time it correctly. And the dose, obviously you don't want to go too long too with fasting, because beyond a certain point, there's sort of diminishing returns.
Yeah. So you're saying don't fast if you get sick. What should you do if you get sick?
So typically, based on the clinical studies, we don't have anything currently really right now with coronavirus. The only thing that I know of that was tested was calciferol, which is like a partially activated vitamin D analog. It was a small clinical study. I think it was in about 50 hospitalized COVID patients. And essentially they gave this vitamin D analog, and it reduced the risk of ending up in the ICU by about 25-fold. Which is, that's a huge benefit, but I think because it was a small study, we really need to see it replicated. But yeast beta-glucan has a lot of data for reducing upper respiratory tract infections, especially people who are active. Same with vitamin C. If you're active, vitamin C has a lot of evidence for reducing the duration and severity of the common cold. Vitamin D seems to potentially, at least if you have sufficient vitamin D levels compared to deficient, you are at like a 50% lower risk of having a positive COVID test. And so we're thinking that because vitamin D is important for, sort of like epithelial health, endothelial health, and may actually potentially reduce the risk of even getting COVID. Now, we can't say that like definitively, but there's multiple studies that have now shown that if you have better vitamin D levels, that you are at a lower risk of having a positive test for COVID.
Yeah. And it's scary because I live in Nebraska. And so when you look at our latitude and where we are at in relation to the equator, because of course sun exposure is very helpful, right? We see levels peak typically in about September, and then they go down and down and down and down and down and down all the way through April, which is exactly when we see viral and flu season typically. And it will be interesting with all the social distancing and masking to see what happens with influenza this year. But okay, so so nutrition is number one. Next is exercise. So does exercise help with immunity? How does that play into our immune system?
So exercise is great for the immunity up to a certain point. And so like, just like with nutrients, you have like sort of this sigmoidal curve, and essentially what seems to be the best is moderate to strenuous activity up to about 60 minutes. And then as soon as you start going above that hour, it's not that you should never exercise longer than an hour intensely. It's just that it does seem to increase the incidence of upper respiratory tract infections by anywhere from 2 to 6-fold, whereas moderate exercise or even high intensity exercise less than an hour seems to reduce the risk of upper respiratory tract infections by about 50%.
Yeah. So I always remind people exercise is like a stress on the body. It's going to help you, bigger, faster, stronger, but just like everything, a U-shaped curve. So super important there. Okay, let's talk about one thing that I think is like one of the most underplayed health benefits, and that is sleep. Talk about the relationship of sleep and immunity.
So just a few days of getting poor sleep can lead to insulin resistance. And partly because melatonin levels will obviously drop as your sleep is more dysfunctioned. And melatonin is not just a sleep hormone, it's actually a master antioxidant that can cross into any cell. And mammal studies are showing that we actually concentrate melatonin in the bone marrow to potentially protect our stem cells and our immature immune cells from oxidative stress. So if your lack of sleep lasts longer than a few days, you can dramatically deplete the melatonin levels in your bone marrow, which may, make your stem cells more susceptible to damage. And that obviously is going to affect your immune system. And we essentially, again, we have another evolutionary mismatch between, we evolved with a 24-hour light dark cycle, and our days used to be extremely bright and our nights used to be extremely dark. And now we're dealing with sort of dim days because we're mostly indoors, and dim nights. And that completely messes up your whole circadian clock. And you essentially have this master clock that controls your peripheral clocks and how your hormones are secreted throughout the day. So it's really crazy to think that like light dark cycles can actually control like how your hormones are secreted throughout the day. And that's going to totally affect your immune system.
Yeah, big time. I talk to patients about this all the time when I talk about sleep hygiene. And part of it is really kind of respecting your circadian rhythm. I think everyone just thinks that you're just supposed to lay down and fall asleep, but they've been like on their smartphone all evening or on their computer all evening. They haven't been outdoors because we're in cars and planes and buildings and things like that. And we've completely lost touch with nature. So and you don't need a lot of sunlight, but like 10 minutes of solid sunlight. So whether it's just like getting outside over your lunch break and taking a walk or whatever it is, it's super important. And then, when you wake up, immediately trying to expose yourself, like open the windows, and in the night, close the windows, dim the lights. Blue blockers, I think they're kind of the hot thing. You do have to remember that like the ones for computers, they don't block as much of a degree of light. But definitely all little things that you can use to try to help your own melatonin. Do you think, back to supplements and nutraceuticals, is melatonin supplementation helpful? Number one, for the circadian rhythm, and number two, COVID.
So it's interesting that a preprint just released on if COVID patients and non-COVID patients, they looked at, it was from New York Presbyterian, and there was about 900 COVID patients that they looked at that was intubated, and about 25 to 3,500 non-COVID patients that were intubated for numerous reasons. And they looked to see if the administration of melatonin, it was a retrospective study, again, so we can't prove causation, but those individuals that got melatonin supplementation were at an 83% lower risk of dying. So it was the most, the strongest correlate with the lowest risk of death. So they looked at numerous different medications like dexamethasone and budesonide were also associated with lower risks of death in intubated COVID patients, but melatonin was by far the strongest sort of protective cofactor or correlate, so to speak, with a lower risk of dying in COVID patients. And again, because it's this master antioxidant, they're thinking that there may be some serious benefits to dosing sick COVID patients with melatonin. We just don't know for sure. But what's interesting is there are meta-analyses of clinical studies testing high dose melatonin at night, like 20 to 30 milligrams. And those randomized studies have shown significant reductions in mortality in numerous cancer studies. So
Yeah.
I think even beyond COVID, there seems to be some potential benefit of melatonin.
Yeah, I think there's some things we don't know. And for everybody's reference, if your doctor told you to take melatonin for sleep or circadian rhythm, you're probably taking in the ballpark of like 1 to 2 milligrams. So
Right.
what we're talking about is like 10-fold of that, 20, 30 milligrams of melatonin. So let's talk about the relationship that our immune system plays to there. Sometimes our immune system can go haywire, right? So we take care of it, we support it, but we can get things like cancer and autoimmunity. Can you talk about what happens in these situations? How does the immune system go wrong?
So essentially we have these regulatory T cells. They're called TREGs, or T regulatory cells. And essentially they're supposed to regulate if your immune system sees itself or if it sees a foreign pathogen. And sometimes it can sort of mess up and think that yourself is a foreign pathogen. And we think things that increase that risk would be a deficiency in vitamin D and vitamin A, because those two nutrients affect how well your T regulatory cells work. And it's interesting because people who have poor COVID outcomes, they actually have autoantibodies to their own type 1 interferon. So we produce these cytokines to actually prevent viral replication called interferons. But these COVID patients that aren't doing well are producing autoantibodies against their own interferons, and they don't actually produce as much. And so there's a loss in the checkpoints for the B cells that produce antibodies somewhere along the line, and it likely has to do with the poor nutrient status and poor metabolic health.
Yeah, and it seems to be with these COVID patients is that as soon as they hit that point in the illness where they get this cytokine storm that happens is typically where we see them really start to go downhill. And then of course we know from the data that as soon as they get to needing ventilatory support, the outcomes are extremely poor. So super important there. Okay, let's go back to nutrition for just a second, because you have a whole chapter in here talking essentially about balancing omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. And I think this is an important thing to talk about because there's, of course, a lot of people out there with a lot of opinions. We've always heard eat more omega-3s, but talk about what the relationship is between cholesterol and lipids and omegas and our immune system, and what should we really be consuming in our diet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I sort of unpack a lot of this in my book, Superfuel, but essentially saturated fats don't really raise LDL that much if you have good omega-3 status. And so it's kind of interesting that we've sort of blamed saturated fat for causing heart disease simply because it raises LDL, when it completely depends on the person and their background intake of omega-3. And so essentially omega-3 seems to dramatically reduce that increase in LDL with saturated fats. And we now know that it's really cooking with the highly susceptible to oxidation oils like the omega-6 seed oils. That's the real problem. And it's really oxidized LDL. That's the issue, not necessarily just native LDL.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think about omega-3 supplementation versus whole food sources, and for that matter, whole food sources of omega-6? So you talked about toxic seed oils, canola. What about whole food sources?
Well, we need omega-6. It's an essential fatty acid, and it does concentrate in the brain. And sort of in something that I've always have discussed is that we should always try to get our nutrients from our food first. And because your whole food is going to package those fats with antioxidants, vitamins, and other nutrients, and protects it from oxidizing. So nuts and seeds, if you can tolerate them, even though they contain omega-6, it's not very susceptible to oxidation. You're getting all the benefits of the vitamin E and nutrients that comes with it. In regards to omega-3 supplementation, there is a lot of data that omega-3 supplements do help. That's probably because all of us are so deficient. But I think that getting it from wild salmon is so much better. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that fish oil supplements have gotten a bad rap because there are studies done. It's nutraceuticals, not some places don't test, you don't know where they're produced, how long have they been sitting on the shelf, they could be oxidized. So I'm the same way. I actually don't take a supplement, but I do like fish roe, salmon, other sources, eggs, beef, other sources of omega-3s in the diet. But I think that's a good thing to point out, that eating like whole walnuts is not the same as drinking canola oil.
100%. Yeah.
Both being, more omega-6s. Okay, so other things that you can do to help your immune system. I have a monthly coaching group, and this month they're taking cold showers.
Mhm.
And I gave an entire lecture last night on cold therapy and why things like this are helpful to a variety of issues, including our immune system. But can you talk about like heat and cold and the extremes of temperature and how that might help with immunity?
So essentially, like what I've learned about health and immune system is like if you give yourself a low dose of a stressor, it makes your cells stronger to almost any other type of stressor, essentially, when it comes to at least infections. The next day, your body is sort of like more resilient. And so that's sort of like the goal with cold therapy and heat therapy is you're stressing your cells out. So for example, if you go into a sauna, you start breaking down your proteins and you get a release of heat shock proteins that start repairing those proteins. So when you start breaking down proteins from an inflammatory cytokine storm and you have sort of heat shocked yourself for many weeks, your immune system and your cells themselves are so much more resilient. And that's really the goal, is to not only make your cells more resilient, but if you go into a sauna, you actually are mimicking our first line of defense against infections, which is a fever. And so heat shock proteins are really cool because we've evolved with them. And in order for a virus to replicate inside the cell, it has to export this viral ribonucleoprotein complex out of the cell. And in order to do that, there's a protein called M1 protein that has to dock onto that complex so it can export. Heat shock protein 70 can bind to that complex and prevent M1 protein from binding and prevent viral export. So it's sort of like you're hacking this ancient evolutionary mechanism of fever when you go into a sauna. And so cold shock proteins are something kind of similar as well. And you sort of get similar benefits with cold shock proteins.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, as a kid, like as soon as you got a fever, you needed medicine to like bring your fever down, right? But it's just symptomatic because you feel horrible when your fever is like 104. Do you think people should treat fevers? Do you let a fever ride out? What's your thoughts about that and illness?
So in an adult, I think if your fever is like 104 or higher, there may be some benefit to treating it. But if you treat a fever that's below 104, you're probably doing yourself a disservice, because a lot of RNA viruses, they don't have many kinks or weaknesses, but one of their weaknesses is heat. For some reason, RNA viruses just don't do well with heat. And so if you are at an elevated temperature, it does seem to reduce viral replication.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And then of course in children we treat because they can get febrile seizures and things like that. But
Right.
COVID doesn't seem to affect kids the way it does with adults. Do you like understand that, or why is that?
So kids have a very robust initial immune response, and they sort of take care of the virus very quickly and clear it very quickly. What happens in adults that don't do well with COVID is their sort of initial assault is weak, and then the virus sort of just comes back in a second wave even stronger.
Yeah. And kind of on that same note, can we talk a little bit about, you've got a great chapter in here that kind of breaks down for people that don't understand how our immune system works. So we have this innate immune system and this adaptive immune system. And with the adaptive immune system is kind of what you're, describing here. Can you talk a little bit about, that's another fear I have, it's like with vaccines, is they say, well, if you've had it, you're less likely to have as severe of illness when you do get it, right? Because you've already kind of primed the immune system. But then there's these studies that show patients vaccinated with influenza vaccination are at a higher risk of COVID. Talk about that just a little bit in the face of these RNA viruses. Is it better to get it? Is it better to have a vaccination? Is that individualized? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't think we know with this novel coronavirus, but I mean, my instinct is telling me that even if you get common cold coronaviruses, there seems to be about a 50% cross reactivity, meaning if you've been exposed to common cold coronaviruses, your T cells seem to recognize the novel coronavirus. And it's because the sequence is very similar. I mean, there are differences, but I mean, essentially, it's probably 95% the same. And so we don't know if the cross reactivity means cross immunity, but it's, in my feeling is that there is probably some type of cross immunity from prior coronavirus exposures.
Yeah. Like I said, it will be so interesting this season with people more inside their houses, social distancing. I'm kind of afraid that maybe our immune systems aren't surveying our environment a lot this season, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
So here's a good story to tell. Back with the 1918 Spanish flu, there were a few waves, but once it ran its course through everyone, essentially people had quote unquote herd immunity. Not that they didn't get sick from it, they just didn't really die from it anymore. And essentially, that's the goal, is to eventually get to a place where you can get this type of virus, but you're no longer going to die from it. And I think there's a huge divide. But the main reason why people are fans of lockdowns is to give people time to develop better medications for the metabolically sick people who can't tolerate this novel coronavirus, and give people time for vaccines, because some people can't handle it. And so there's a lot of people who are, worried about their elderly grandparents, or their, type 2 diabetic dad, that they just want more time to kind of go by. And then there's the people who are healthy and they're like, why should my life stop when I'm, at like a 0.2% chance of dying from it? So it's very polarizing to talk about.
Okay, so in reality though, say somebody picks up Immunity Fix, reads it, they're totally into it. Okay, I'm going to change my diet. I'm going to start exercising, do the sauna, take some supplements. In what reasonable amount of time could somebody really be making an impact for their risk for something like COVID or coronavirus? Are we talking days, or are we talking months to years?
I would say days to weeks. And we know this because there's been clinical studies where they'll take people who are consuming a diet of about 20% added sugars, and they'll drop them down to 10 or 5%. And within 4 to 5 weeks, their blood pressure, their triglycerides, their glucose levels are all virtually normalized. And so you can fix metabolic dysfunction very quickly if you're not at a point of sort of organ failure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the message, that if you've been confused about all the big fancy words that have been thrown around so far with you watching, is that, we've been in lockdown here since March, April. So here we are going on 8, 9, 10 months of all these different measures to slow this down. And every single person, the millions of people in America, have the ability within days to weeks to make a profound impact on your ability to survive this virus if you get it, and to change the severity of your illness, when you do get it. Because the fact of the reality is that, like you described, is that the lockdown was never made to prevent anybody from getting it or getting exposed to it, but was to slow it down, to give us time to look at therapeutics, to not overburden our hospital systems. In our town right now, we're surging again. Our hospitals are at capacity. We don't have enough nurses. It's not PPE right now, but we don't have enough nurses. And that's scary. That's scary when you have lack of resources, and you could get to a point where you could have to look somebody in the face and say, we can't admit you, we can't help you, right? So that's what I think is so powerful about this book. And it's a message that everybody needs to hear in 2020, that you can make this impact. And thank you for putting it out and putting it together, and having it be valid science information, because there's a lot of fact checking going on social media, and there's not the greatest
I'll take that fact check. So
information out there. Yeah. Okay, quickly, because you wrote Salt Fix 2 and Super Fuel, right, is your other one?
Yeah.
But talk about salt and immunity. I think that's another interesting one. Talk about salt, because my followers, I have to like continually educate on sodium consumption, salt consumption. That just seems to be something just like fat that was just nailed into our heads, that it's bad for you and it causes high blood pressure and you need to avoid it.
If you were to talk to someone like 500 years ago that salt was bad, they'd be like, what are you talking about? We wouldn't even have food. We wouldn't even be able to preserve our food without this amazing essential mineral. And so like, they would just laugh at us, like, for thinking that this, natural substance is actually bad. And what's interesting is that salt is your natural antimicrobial, and it has antiviral effects. Like, directly, if you look at like cell cultures, salt will kill not only bacteria, but also RNA, both enveloped and non-enveloped viruses. And what's really interesting is they've done studies where they'll do like hypertonic nasal irrigations, like a neti pot, and gargling with hypertonic salts in people who have had upper respiratory tract infections within 48 hours. And it significantly reduces the duration of that upper respiratory tract infection, reduces viral load, reduces transmission in the house by about 36%. So it's kind of funny that we demonize this, essential mineral, but literally we can use it to sort of like flush out your nasal passages. You have to use sterile water when you do that, or gargle with it, and it helps with sore throats. It may help with gingivitis, and it may even help reduce the duration of upper respiratory tract infections.
What do you think about like a saline nasal spray or something like that?
The nasal sprays don't seem to work as well as like the neti pots. But I think there is some potential benefit. And then how our immune system actually uses salt is really interesting. So it uses chloride, which is sort of 60% of what salt is made up, to essentially kill pathogens. So if you want to have stomach acid, which is hydrochloric acid, you have to have chloride from salt. We can't make it. It's an essential nutrient that comes from salt. And our white blood cells secrete something called hypochlorous acid, which is essentially the compound in bleach. It's a little different, but it's essentially almost the same thing. And it's from chloride. And our immune system even secretes chloride, again, which is from salt, and it combines it with taurine to calm cytokine storms. It's called taurine chlorine. So once the white blood cells have sort of secreted hypochlorous acid, again, utilizing the salt that you eat, it then secretes the chloride with taurine and calms the inflammatory cytokine storm. So it's not only using salt to kill pathogens, but to almost like, suppress the fire after it's been raging. So it's just interesting how our body, again, uses this essential mineral to fight infections.
Yeah. What do you think how much salt do people need? That's a common question that I get, because they've been told over and over and over again, no more than 2,000 milligrams per day, no more than 2,000 milligrams per day. And now some people saying even less than that. But I myself, I'm a board certified ketogenic nutrition specialist, and these people, depending on activity levels, in the hot summer, they're sweating. We could be talking, I believe, upwards of like 5 to 8 grams of salt per day in some of these people.
Yeah. So, the average person, if they're exercising in like 85 to 95 degree weather, is going to lose around a full teaspoon of salt every hour of exercise through sweat. And they're going to lose about 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine every single hour. So if you do exercise in the heat or you go in the sauna, you're going to need a lot more salt. And then coffee also is a huge salt waster. We typically lose about a half a teaspoon of salt for every 4 cups of coffee you drink. So if you are, essentially coffee is not just a diuretic, but it's a salt waster.
I know I get a lot of flack for what I post about coffee. I'm not a huge coffee drinker, and I'm not attacking it because of that. I've never been a hot beverage person, but for women in particular, coffee can have a role in estrogen detoxification and the way that we get rid of estrogen in our bodies, depending on certain genetic SNPs that you might have. And so it's just funny, the things that we totally take for granted that could have a huge, profound impact on our health. And I always tell people, like, whatever you're consuming, always ask yourself, why you're consuming it. Is this helping me? Is this hurting me? you know, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely things that, and I know some people that consume a lot of coffee.
I'm guilty. I consume a lot of coffee.
They're like, I only have 2 cups. I'm like, oh, your 32-ounce Yeti is 1 cup? Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Like telling the doctor I only have 1 drink per day. It's only like a complete handle of vodka. I know how that goes. Okay, so for me, I eat a mostly ketogenic diet. What are your thoughts about therapeutic ketosis in the immune system?
So ketosis seems to potentially suppress what's called NLRP3 inflammasomes, and they seem to have direct antioxidant effects as well. And it's not that you can't have these types of benefits if you're eating a whole food, like plant-based diet. I just think you can get the benefits on the opposite end of the spectrum with ketogenic diets, and it works differently. And so you can certainly get benefits not being in ketosis if you're eating a healthy diet. But I think the opposite end of the spectrum is that you can also get anti-inflammatory benefits from a healthy ketogenic diet. And there's never like a differentiation in the news between like a healthy ketogenic diet and like a really dirty ketogenic diet. And that makes the huge difference.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part of social media and marketing, is that the person sitting at home eating like cream cheese and pepperoni roll-ups versus the person over here eating salmon and broccoli are both played out in the media world the same way, right? And so, and I think the difficult part about ketogenic diets is that when we look at traditional medical research, right, a lot of epidemiology studies, none of them are looking at that in the face of low carb status. And ketones, we know, work as cellular signaling molecules. I think it's just super fascinating. But yeah, a lot of myths that I have to dispel as a practitioner. And I think that we all can agree, whether you are carnivore or whether you are like totally vegan, plant-based, I think we all agree that whole foods, right, avoiding anything that comes in a box or a bag or a jar or whatever it is, because anytime you process food in any way, shape, or form, you're losing nutrient content. You're likely adding some sort of preservatives or these other things to it. So I think we all agree that whole food is the way to go. And it really seems to be bio-individual. I have all the insulin resistant genes, and I'm talking like normal BMI. My grandparents, my dad, both my parents, like normal BMI diabetics. So, you know, things like COVID-19 are scary for our family because we all, you know, carry that susceptibility to insulin resistance. But the cool thing about it is that you can do something about it. And that's what's so powerful. So tell us tell us about like your daily routine. Like, what do you do? I think people think, you know, they're fascinated by people who like, you know, do this kind of stuff and write these amazing books, but like, what do you do on a daily basis? Like, tell us what that's like.
So I guess I'll take you through like what I eat in a day and maybe what I do in a day. But so like usually I'll have like 4 or 5 pastured eggs in the morning, and I'll do scrambled eggs with some organic cheese. And I will also consume pastured meats. Typically what I like to do is to have some liver and heart in a blend with muscle meat. So typically what I'll get is it's like 75% muscle meat and then 25% liver and heart. And I think it's really important because the liver is giving you folate and copper, which you don't really get in muscle meat. And then the heart is giving you a lot of CoQ10. And so typically what I'll do is I might have like one of those types of burgers a day. And then I also will either consume like elk or just pastured like ribeyes or fillets. And so that's really important for B12, for zinc, to just get your protein up too from like a muscle synthesis standpoint. If you're not consuming at least 10 ounces of meat per day, it's going to be very difficult to hit the RDAs for those nutrients that I just listed, but also to even get enough protein to have good muscle protein synthesis. So typically I consume probably anywhere from like a pound to a pound and a half of pastured meat, 4 to 6 pastured eggs. And then I typically get my vitamin D through cod liver oil right now. I will try to do wild salmon once every couple weeks, but I hate the taste of that. I mean, I'll season the heck out of it, but it's a tough one for me to swallow.
I think it's how it's prepared. And when I first started eating salmon, I mean, I didn't like fish in general. And so, you know, I think whitefish is kind of like the less fishier of the fish.
Sure.
Certainly I hate any like trout or anything like that. I can't stand it. But salmon, I've really grown to love salmon. There is a huge difference between conventionally farm-raised salmon. You guys, they literally like feed these salmon like Skittles. And I've noticed when you're cooking it like in a pan, like you can just see all this like disgusting fat coming out. And I'm sure it's all like the corn and things that the salmon was eating. So like you're talking about, you eat pastured eggs, pastured meat, all these types of things.
Right.
Is there a huge difference? What if somebody can only afford, grain-fed meats or whatever it is? Is it still better than fortified grains and all these things, or is there a middle ground as far as health is concerned? Or obviously we know what like good, better, and best is, but
Right. There is a middle ground. If you're getting lean meats from grain-fed animals, it's not as bad. But if you're going with the fattier meats, then that meat is going to be much lower in omega-3 compared to pastured meats and lower in antioxidants. But I do think from a sort of like a global perspective of where we need to move and how we produce food, I personally try not to support monocropping, which that's what we are doing. If we are buying grain finished meat, we are supporting monocropping chemical companies, and it's not net carbon negative, it's net carbon positive when you're consuming that meat. And if we ever want to get out of this, sort of food waste and just where we are globally through, environmental pollution, we have to start pushing these big food companies to go more towards regenerative farming.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have like an overabundance of food. I mean, that's what's crazy is you look at third world countries where like they literally don't have any food, they're famished. And here in America, we have like way more food than we can ever imagine, but it's garbage. And I totally agree. I was just reading an article the other day talking about monocropping and topsoil and how we essentially have about 60 years left before our topsoil is completely gone, like completely gone, if we don't start making a concerted effort for regenerative farming. And animals
Right.
are the answer to fixing the land. Is ruminant animals on the ground, pooping on the ground, living on the ground.
Yep.
And there are farms that are doing that. So I encourage anybody that's listening to reach out to your local farmers. How do they raise their animals? And support those businesses. I think we underestimate how powerful our dollar really is. And I know that when you look at it dollar for dollar, it seems more expensive to buy those things. But when you break it down and you think about the nutrient content, I also think you start to like respect your food. I think, when we think about the way that we spend money, it's how much value do we place in that item, right? Some people might think $100,000 vehicle is worthwhile because they find value in the Lamborghini or whatever it is. I could care less about cars. Like, I'll take the base model. Like, that's just me, right? I would rather spend money on like a vacation to Bora Bora or whatever it is. So we all find value in that. And I think as people start to really see value in their nutrition, because health can't be bought. But food makes such a profound impact in a short period of time. And that's what's cool as a clinician for me, is to just see, even in a 3-month time span, the reversal of chronic disease and things like that.
Right.
So amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all your tools. You guys need to go out and get Immunity Fix. Tell people where they can buy this. Where can they buy Immunity Fix, and where can they find you?
So the Immunity Fix is on Amazon, and my website is drjamesdinick.com, and my Instagram is @drjamesdinick.
Awesome. Appreciate your time. Thanks for what you bring to the world. And if you guys have questions, you can always drop your questions and comments below in this YouTube video, and we'll try to get on and answer it. And I hope we can do more things like this in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Jamie.
Have a great day.
Take care.